The morning of July 12, 1980, dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that only summer in rural Pennsylvania could deliver. The sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Clearwater County, where corn stood tall in perfect rows and the air carried the sweet scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. It was the kind of day that promised adventure, the kind that would etch itself into memory forever, though not for the reasons anyone could have imagined. In the small town of Millbrook, population 3,047, five cousins prepared for what should have been an ordinary family picnic. The Whitmore family had been gathering at Cedar Lake for decades, a tradition that stretched back to when their grandparents first settled in the valley. But this gathering would become something else entirely, a mystery that would haunt 3 generations and leave investigators with more questions than answers. The 5 cousins ranged in age from 8 to 16. Rebecca Whitmore, the eldest at 16, was a responsible girl with auburn hair and freckles scattered across her nose like constellations. Her younger brother Timothy, 14, possessed the restless energy of a boy on the cusp of manhood, always eager to explore beyond the boundaries his parents set. Their cousin Jennifer Walsh, 13, had arrived from Pittsburgh just 2 days earlier for her annual summer visit. Her city polish a stark contrast to her country cousin's easy familiarity with the woods and streams. 8-year-old twins David and Daniel Carr completed the group, identical boys with matching gaps in their front teeth and an uncanny ability to communicate without words. The plan was simple, as family traditions often are. The extended Whitmore clan would meet at Cedar Lake's North Shore picnic area at noon. The adults would handle the cooking and catch up on family news while the children played in the shallows and explored the surrounding woods. It was a routine they'd followed for years without incident, in a time when children roamed freely and parents worried more about scraped knees than stranger danger. But as the morning progressed, a series of small decisions and innocent delays would conspire to create a window of opportunity that someone or something would exploit with devastating precision. The first deviation from tradition came when Rebecca's parents, Robert and Margaret Whitmore, received an urgent call from Margaret's sister in Philadelphia. Their elderly aunt had suffered a fall and was being rushed to the hospital. After hurried consultations with the other adults, it was decided that Robert and Margaret would drive to the city immediately, leaving Rebecca in charge of her younger brother and cousins until the other family members arrived at the lake. "You are responsible for them," Margaret had told her daughter, gripping Rebecca's shoulders with unusual intensity. "Don't let them out of your sight, especially the twins. They have a talent for trouble." Rebecca had nodded solemnly, accepting the weight of responsibility with the seriousness that made her seem older than her 16 years. She had babysat her cousins before, and Cedar Lake was as familiar to her as her own backyard. What could possibly go wrong? The second deviation came when Uncle Frank Carr, father of the twins, called to say his truck had broken down on Route 15. He and his wife Helen would be at least 2 hours late. Similarly, Jennifer's parents, Tom and Patricia Walsh, were delayed by heavy traffic leaving Pittsburgh. What should have been a coordinated family arrival had dissolved into a scattered timeline that left 5 children essentially unsupervised for several critical hours. Rebecca loaded her charges into her father's blue Ford pickup truck. She had just gotten her license 2 months earlier, and headed for Cedar Lake. The drive took them along winding country roads, where maple and oak trees formed a verdant canopy overhead, creating a tunnel of green that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns on the windshield. The children were in high spirits, their voices raised in an off-key rendition of a popular song from the radio. Timothy had brought his new Polaroid camera, a birthday gift he was eager to test. Jennifer clutched a paperback romance novel she'd been secretly reading, while the twins shared a bag of penny candy that would undoubtedly spoil their appetites for lunch. Cedar Lake itself was a natural wonder, formed thousands of years ago by glacial activity that had carved a deep, clear basin in the Pennsylvania hills. The lake stretched for nearly 2 miles, its surface so still on calm days that it perfectly mirrored the sky above. Dense forests of pine, maple, and birch surrounded the water on 3 sides, while the fourth opened onto the meadow where the county had built its modest recreation area. Rebecca parked the truck in the gravel lot beside the empty picnic pavilion. The isolation didn't concern her. They were simply early, and other families would arrive throughout the day. She had packed a cooler with sandwiches and drinks, enough to keep everyone satisfied until the adults arrived with the main feast. The children spent the first hour playing in the shallow water near the swimming area, a roped-off section of the lake where the bottom was sandy and the water remained chest-deep even for the twins. Timothy snapped photos with his Polaroid, delighting in the instant gratification of watching images develop before his eyes. Jennifer alternated between reading her book and keeping a watchful eye on her younger cousins, while Rebecca attempted to braid wildflowers into a crown, a craft she'd learned from her grandmother. It was during their second hour at the lake that the twins made a discovery that would set everything in motion. David and Daniel had grown bored with the swimming area and had begun exploring the shoreline to the east, where fallen logs created natural diving platforms and the water dropped off more dramatically. It was there, partially hidden by overgrown cattails and wild rose bushes, that they found the old well. The structure was clearly ancient, built from hand-fitted stones that had weathered to a pale gray. A rusted iron grate covered the opening, secured with a heavy padlock that had turned green with verdigris. Carved into one of the stones was a date, 1847, along with initials that had been worn nearly smooth by more than a century of Pennsylvania weather. "Rebecca, Jennifer, come look at this," David called out, his voice carrying across the water with the clarity that only children's voices possess. The older girls made their way around the shoreline, Timothy following close behind with his camera at the ready. When they reached the well, Rebecca felt a strange chill despite the warm afternoon sun. There was something unsettling about the structure, something that seemed to whisper of secrets better left undisturbed. "It's probably just an old farm well," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "The farmer probably locked it to keep animals from falling in." Jennifer knelt beside the well and peered through the gaps in the iron grate. The opening disappeared into absolute darkness, and when she dropped a small stone through the bars, they listened for what seemed like an eternity before hearing the distant splash far below. "It's deep," she whispered, and something in her tone made the twins step back instinctively. Timothy raised his camera and snapped a photo of the well, the flash seeming unnecessarily bright in the dappled sunlight. When the image developed, they gathered around to examine it, but the Polaroid revealed nothing more than what they could see with their naked eyes, just an old stone well with a locked grate, innocent and ordinary in the flat light of the photograph. But photographs, as they would later learn, don't always capture the full truth of a moment. It was Daniel who first noticed the scratches. While the others examined Timothy's photograph, the younger twin had remained crouched beside the well, running his small fingers along the stone surface. Near the base, partially obscured by moss and decades of accumulated debris, were marks carved into the stone. Not the weathered initials and date they'd already discovered, but fresher scratches, desperate, jagged lines that looked as though they'd been made by fingernails. "Someone was trying to get out," Daniel said with the matter-of-fact tone that only children use when confronting the incomprehensible. Rebecca knelt beside him and brushed away the moss and dirt. The scratches were indeed there, a chaotic pattern of lines and gouges that spoke of desperation and terror. Some appeared to be attempts at letters or words, but time and weather had made them nearly illegible. "We should go back," Jennifer said, standing abruptly. Her book fell forgotten to the ground, its pages fluttering in a breeze that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. "This place feels wrong." But Timothy was fascinated rather than frightened. He began photographing the scratches from different angles, using up the remaining film in his camera. Each flash seemed to make the shadows around the well deeper, as though the light itself was being absorbed by the ancient stones. Rebecca felt torn between her natural curiosity and her responsibility for the younger children. The rational part of her mind insisted that the well was simply a relic from the area's farming past, that the scratches could have been made by anything, animals, tools, even vandals with too much time on their hands. But another part of her, A deeper instinct that spoke in her grandmother's voice urged her to gather the children and leave immediately. The decision was made for her when the twins discovered the second anomaly. While Timothy photographed the scratches and Jennifer paced nervously behind him, David and Daniel had continued their exploration of the well's perimeter. The structure was larger than it had initially appeared, extending several feet in each direction and surrounded by what had once been a circular stone platform. Much of this platform was now broken and overgrown, but in one section, the stones remained intact and level. It was here that the twins found the symbols. Carved into the flat stones of the platform were markings unlike anything any of them had seen before. They weren't letters from any alphabet Rebecca recognized, nor were they the kind of casual graffiti that teenagers might leave behind. These symbols were deliberate and complex, arranged in patterns that seemed to follow some internal logic that remained frustratingly just beyond comprehension. Some of the symbols resembled twisted trees or gnarled hands reaching upward. Others looked like celestial bodies, stars and moons and comets frozen in stone. Still others defied easy description, combining geometric shapes with organic curves in ways that made the eye uncomfortable, as though the mind couldn't quite process what it was seeing. "Timothy," Rebecca called, her voice tight with growing unease, "take pictures of these two, then we are leaving." But when Timothy tried to photograph the symbols, his camera began to malfunction. The first shot produced only darkness, as though the flash hadn't fired. The second yielded an image so overexposed that the symbols were invisible against a field of white. The third attempt seemed to work normally, but when the image developed, the symbols appeared different, rearranged somehow, as though they'd moved while the camera wasn't looking. It was then that they heard the sound. It began as a low humming, almost below the threshold of hearing, like the distant drone of insects or the rumble of far-off machinery. But as they stood frozen around the well, the sound grew clearer and more distinct. It was rising from below, from the depths of the well itself. It was the sound of voices, not words, exactly, but something that might have been human speech filtered through water and stone, and an impossible distance. The voices seemed to overlap and interweave, creating harmonies that were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. And underneath it all was another sound, the rhythmic scraping of fingernails against stone. Jennifer was the first to break. She turned and ran toward the truck, her long hair streaming behind her like a banner. The twins followed immediately, their identical faces pale with terror they were too young to articulate. Timothy hesitated for a moment, camera still in his hands, caught between fear and the journalist's instinct to document the impossible. Rebecca grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the well. As they ran, the humming grew louder, and she could swear she heard her name being called from the depths below. Not shouted, but whispered with an intimacy that made her skin crawl. They reached the truck breathless and shaking. Rebecca fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling so badly that she dropped them twice before managing to start the engine. As they drove away from Cedar Lake, none of them looked back at the well, though each felt the weight of invisible eyes watching their departure. The drive home passed in silence, broken only by Daniel's quiet sobbing and the occasional click of Timothy's camera as he compulsively advanced the film to frames that no longer existed. When they reached the Whitmore house, Rebecca sent the others inside and sat alone in the truck for several minutes, trying to process what they'd experienced. She told herself that it had been their imagination, fed by the isolation and the unsettling appearance of the old well. Children were prone to group hysteria. She'd learned that in psychology class. A few strange sounds, some old carvings, and suddenly everything became sinister and supernatural. But the photographs told a different story. When Timothy developed the remaining images later that evening, they revealed details that none of them remembered seeing. In the background of his shots of the well, barely visible in the shadows between the trees, were shapes that might have been figures watching from the forest. The photograph of the symbols showed not the carved markings they'd found, but different symbols, entirely symbols that seemed to shift and change each time someone looked at the image. Most disturbing of all was the final photograph, the one Timothy swore he hadn't taken. It showed the 5 of them standing around the well, but their faces were wrong. Instead of their own features, they wore the expressions of strangers' older faces marked by suffering and despair. And in the depths of the well, barely visible through the iron grate, was a pale hand pressed against the bars from below. Rebecca hid the photographs in her bedroom dresser and made Timothy promise never to speak of what they'd found. She told their parents that they'd had a lovely time at the lake and that nothing unusual had happened. When pressed for details about why they'd returned early, she claimed that the twins had gotten tired and cranky. But that night, Rebecca lay awake listening to sounds from outside her window, sounds that might have been wind in the trees or night birds calling to their mates, sounds that might have been voices calling her name. 3 days later, the families reconvened for another picnic at Cedar Lake. This time, all the adults were present, and the gathering proceeded exactly as tradition dictated. The children swam and played while the grown-ups cooked hamburgers and shared gossip. When someone suggested exploring the eastern shore, Rebecca quickly volunteered to organize a game of volleyball instead. As the afternoon wore on, she began to relax. Perhaps the incident at the well had indeed been nothing more than overactive imagination and group suggestion. Perhaps the photographs were simply the result of an old camera and teenage inexperience with lighting and exposure. But as the sun began to set and the families prepared to pack up their belongings, 8-year-old Daniel approached Rebecca with a question that turned her blood to ice. "Rebecca," he said, his young voice carrying perfectly in the still evening air, "why is that lady at the well calling my name?" Rebecca followed his gaze toward the eastern shore, where the ancient well lay hidden among the cattails and wild roses. There, barely visible in the gathering dusk, stood a figure in a white dress. The woman, if woman she was, raised one pale hand in what might have been a greeting or a beckoning gesture, and then she was gone, leaving behind only shadows and the growing conviction that their encounter with the well had been merely the beginning of something far more terrible than any of them could imagine. The family finished packing in record time, though none of the adults seemed to notice the children's sudden urgency to leave. As they drove away from Cedar Lake for the second time that week, Rebecca caught Timothy's eye in the rearview mirror. His face was pale, and she knew he'd seen the woman too. What none of them realized was that their visit to the well had not gone unnoticed by forces that had been waiting far longer than anyone could imagine. The ancient stones had recorded their presence, the symbols had noted their faces, and something in the depths below had marked them for return. The last entry in Rebecca's diary, found years later among her possessions, was dated July 5th. "We shouldn't have gone to the well. I know that now. But it's too late to undo what we have done. The dreams are getting worse, and I can hear them calling even when I'm awake." Timothy says his photographs are changing on their own, showing things that weren't there before. The twins won't speak to anyone except each other, and Jennifer keeps asking when we are going back to the lake. "I think we have to go back. I think something is waiting for us there. God help us, I think we want to go back." The stage was set for tragedy, though none of the adults recognized the signs. In 3 weeks, the 5 cousins would return to Cedar Lake for what was planned as their final picnic of the summer. They would arrive as 5 and leave as none, vanishing so completely that it would take 44 years for the first trace of their fate to surface. August 3rd, 1980, arrived with an oppressive humidity that seemed to press down on Clearwater County like a wet blanket. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of storms that refused to break. It was the kind of weather that made people irritable and restless, the kind that preceded violent thunderstorms and freak accidents. The Whitmore family's final picnic of the summer had been postponed twice due to scheduling conflicts, but Margaret Whitmore insisted they keep this date. Her sister's recovery in Philadelphia was progressing well, and she was eager to restore some normalcy to their disrupted summer routine. Besides, the weather forecast promised clearing skies by afternoon. What the weather forecast didn't mention was that atmospheric pressure readings for that morning were the lowest recorded in Clearwater County since 1932. The same year that 3 hikers had vanished without a trace in the nearby state forest, their bodies never found despite an extensive search involving state police and volunteer trackers. The 5 cousins had spent the intervening weeks in a strange state of anticipation. Rebecca's diary entries, discovered decades later during the estate settlement, revealed a growing obsession with returning to Cedar Lake. She wrote of dreams where she stood at the edge of the well, listening to voices that spoke in languages she almost understood. Timothy had become fixated on his photographs, spending hours studying them with a magnifying glass, claiming he could see new details appearing each time he looked. Jennifer had cut her Pittsburgh visit short by a week, telling her parents she was homesick, though her real reason was a compulsion she couldn't explain, a need to be present for whatever was going to happen at the lake. The twins had grown increasingly inseparable, communicating in whispers and glances that excluded even their parents. Their mother, Helen Carr, later told investigators that in the days before the picnic, she had often found them standing at their bedroom window at dawn, staring in the direction of Cedar Lake as though waiting for a signal. The morning of August 3rd brought an unusual gathering to the Whitmore household. Unlike previous picnics where families arrived separately throughout the day, everyone converged at once as though drawn by some unspoken agreement. Robert Whitmore later described it as the strangest thing, receiving phone calls from his brother and brother-in-law within minutes of each other, all asking if they could arrive early, all claiming they'd had trouble sleeping and wanted to get an early start. By 9:30 a.m., 3 cars were loaded with picnic supplies and 14 family members, 9 adults and 5 children. The convoy set out for Cedar Lake with Rebecca riding in the lead vehicle with her parents, claiming she wanted to help set up. In reality, she was fighting an almost physical need to reach the lake as quickly as possible, a compulsion that made her skin crawl even as she surrendered to it. The adults noticed the children's strange mood, but attributed it to excitement about the outing. What they failed to observe were the subtle signs that something was fundamentally wrong. The way the twins moved in perfect synchronization without looking at each other, how Timothy's hands shook as he loaded film into his camera, the fact that Jennifer had packed her bag as though preparing for a much longer journey than a day at the lake. The drive to Cedar Lake took them along the same winding roads the children had traveled 3 weeks earlier, but the landscape seemed different now, darker somehow, despite the broad daylight. The trees that had formed a welcoming canopy in July now pressed close to the road like gathering crowds. Wildlife that should have been abundant in late summer was conspicuously absent. No birds sang from the branches, no squirrels chattered in the underbrush, no insects buzzed against the windshields. When they reached the lake, the families found the parking area completely empty despite the weekend timing. The absence of other visitors should have been a warning, but the adults were too busy unloading coolers and setting up tables to notice the unnatural silence that had settled over the area. Cedar Lake itself looked different than it had just 3 weeks before. The water, usually crystal clear, had taken on a murky green tinge that the adults dismissed as typical late summer algae bloom. But the children knew better. They could see shapes moving beneath the surface, not fish, but something larger and more deliberate in its movements. The well remained exactly where they had found it, hidden among the cattails on the eastern shore. None of the children mentioned its existence to the adults, though each felt its presence like a magnetic pull. Rebecca found herself unconsciously gravitating toward the eastern shore throughout the morning, only to catch herself and return to the family gathering with excuses about collecting wildflowers or working on the twins. The morning proceeded with deceptive normalcy. The adults cooked hamburgers and hot dogs over a charcoal grill, while sharing gossip and summer plans. The younger cousins played in the designated swimming area, though they remained unusually quiet and stayed closer to shore than usual. Timothy took photographs of the family gathering, but his hands shook so badly that many of the shots came out blurred. It was during lunch that the first openly strange incident occurred. Helen Carr was serving potato salad when she noticed that the twins were staring fixedly toward the eastern shore. Following their gaze, she saw nothing unusual, just the typical shoreline vegetation and the play of shadows as clouds moved across the sun. But when she looked back at David and Daniel, their expressions had changed to something she would later describe to police as hungry anticipation. "Boys," she called softly, "what are you looking at?" "She's waving," Daniel replied, without shifting his gaze. "Who's waving, honey?" "The lady in the white dress," David added, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone children use when stating obvious truths. Helen looked again toward the eastern shore but saw nothing except vegetation moving in the breeze. When she asked the other adults if they noticed anything unusual, they all looked in the same direction and reported seeing nothing out of the ordinary. But the children all saw her. Each of them, without consulting the others, could see the woman in the white dress standing among the cattails. She was pale as moonlight, with long dark hair that moved despite the absence of wind. Her dress appeared to be from another era, high-necked and ankle-length, with intricate lacework that seemed to shift and change when viewed direct. The woman never moved from her position by the shoreline, but her presence grew stronger as the afternoon progressed. By 2 p.m., she was no longer alone. Other figures had joined her, men, women, and children in clothing that spanned decades or perhaps centuries. They stood motionless among the reeds, watching the family picnic with expressions of infinite patience. Only the 5 cousins could see them, and the weight of that shared secret created a bond that excluded everyone else. They began to move as a unit, unconsciously mirroring each other's gestures and finishing each other's sentences. When Rebecca suggested they explore the shoreline, the others agreed immediately, though none could have explained why. The adults, deep in conversation about mundane family matters, barely noticed when the children announced they were going for a walk. Margaret Whitmore called after them to stay together and be back within an hour, receiving Rebecca's solemn promise in return. It was 2:47 p.m. when the 5 cousins disappeared into the cattails along the eastern shore. They would never be seen alive again. The well waited for them exactly as they had left it, though the symbols carved into the surrounding platform seemed more distinct now, as though highlighted by an invisible light source. The iron grate remained locked, but the padlock hung differently than before, looser somehow, as though the metal had expanded in the heat. Timothy immediately began photographing the well and its surroundings, working with a fever that alarmed his cousins. The camera clicked rapidly as he captured image after image, the Polaroid film advancing with mechanical precision. But when the photographs developed, they showed scenes that none of them remembered posing for. In one image, the 5 children stood in a circle around the well, holding hands. None of them recalled joining hands. In another, they were all looking down into the depths through the grate, though they had barely arrived. Most disturbing was a photograph that showed them walking toward the well from the direction of the lake. But Timothy swore he had taken it while they were already at the well. "The pictures are wrong," Jennifer whispered, though she couldn't look away from them. "The pictures are right," Rebecca replied, her voice strangely distant. "We are the ones who are wrong." The woman in the white dress was closer now, standing just at the edge of the clearing around the well. Up close, her beauty was terrible and absolute, the kind of perfection that exists only in death. Her skin was translucent as porcelain, her lips the color of dried roses. When she smiled, her teeth were small and white and sharp. She spoke to them in a voice like wind through empty houses. "You came back." It wasn't a question. The twins stepped forward first, moving in their eerie synchronization. They placed their small hands on the padlock, and it fell open with a sound like breaking glass. The iron grate swung wide on hinges that should have been rusted solid, revealing the dark throat of the well. The other figures from the shoreline had joined them now, dozens of people in clothing from different eras, all sharing the same translucent pallor, all wearing expressions of welcome that chilled the blood. They formed a circle around the well, and Rebecca realized with growing horror that some of the faces were familiar. There was the elderly man from the Historical Society who had disappeared while researching local legends in 1975. The teenage girl who had vanished during a camping trip in 1968. The three hikers from 1932, and others, stretching back through the decades, all wearing the same patient smiles. "Your turn," the woman in white said, and her voice was joined by all the others in a chorus that harmonized with the humming they had heard weeks before. Rebecca tried to resist, tried to grab her cousins and run back to the safety of the family picnic. But her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her to the edge of the well. When she looked down into the depths, she saw not water but stars and infinite darkness scattered with points of light that formed patterns she almost recognized. Timothy continued photographing even as he walked to the well's edge, the camera clicking with mechanical persistence. Jennifer dropped her book and followed, her face serene as a sleepwalker's. The twins moved together, their hands clasped, their identical faces reflecting identical acceptance. One by one, they stepped onto the stone platform surrounding the well. The symbols carved into the stones began to glow with a cold phosphorescence, creating patterns that hurt to look at direct. The humming grew louder, joined now by other sounds, whispers in languages that predated human speech, the rustle of clothing that had rotted away decades ago, the soft splash of water that might have been tears or blood, or something else entirely. Rebecca was the last to approach the well's edge. As she looked down into the star-filled darkness, she understood at last what they had disturbed during their first visit. The well was not a well at all, but a threshold, a place where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. The figures around them were not ghosts, but guardians, protectors of a secret that had been hidden in the Pennsylvania hills for centuries. And now it was their turn to join that guardianship. The last photograph Timothy took showed all five cousins standing at the edge of the well, their faces illuminated by the strange phosphorescent glow from the symbols. Behind them, the circle of watchers raised their hands in salute or farewell, and in the depths of the well, something vast and ancient stirred in response to the offering. The photograph was found 44 years later, perfectly preserved in Timothy's camera, which would be discovered in circumstances that defied explanation. Back at the picnic site, the adults continued their conversations, unaware that anything was amiss. It wasn't until 4:30 p.m. that Margaret Whitmore checked her watch and realized the children had been gone for nearly 2 hours. She sent Robert to call them back, expecting to find them playing by the water's edge or exploring the hiking trails. He found nothing. The search that followed was immediate and intensive. The families scoured the shoreline, calling the children's names until their voices were hoarse. When the local police arrived an hour later, they brought tracking dogs and additional volunteers. By nightfall, the search had expanded to include state police, forest rangers, and emergency response teams from 3 counties. But they found no trace of the 5 cousins. No footprints led away from the lake. No clothing was discovered snagged on branches. No signs of struggle marked the ground. It was as though 5 children had simply stepped out of the world and left no evidence of their passing. The search continued for 2 weeks, expanding to cover over 50 square miles of forest and farmland. Divers explored every accessible portion of Cedar Lake. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept the area repeatedly. Volunteers combed through dense underbrush and checked every abandoned building, mine shaft and natural cave in the region. The investigation that followed consumed thousands of man-hours and generated a case file that eventually filled 4 large boxes. Police interviewed every family member, friend, and acquaintance of the missing children. They examined the possibility of kidnapping, though no ransom demand ever materialized. They investigated the theory that the children had run away together, though none had shown any signs of unhappiness or desire to leave home. The case went cold within 6 months, though Detective Raymond Walsh, Jennifer's uncle, who had requested assignment to the investigation, continued working it obsessively for the next 3 years. His case notes, discovered after his death in 1995, revealed a man driven to the edge of sanity by his failure to find answers. Walsh had focused much of his later investigation on local legends and folklore, interviewing elderly residents about stories connected to Cedar Lake. He had compiled a disturbing collection of tales dating back to the early 1800s, stories of people who went to the lake and never returned, of strange lights seen dancing over the water on moonless nights, of voices calling from beneath the surface. One interview, conducted with 89-year-old Emma Patterson in 1982, proved particularly significant. "My great-grandmother told me about that place when I was just a child. Said there was something in the lake that was older than the Indians, older than the trees. Said it slept most of the time, but every so often it would wake up hungry. That's when people would go missing, always by the water, always without a trace." She said the early settlers tried to seal it up somehow, built some kind of marker stone by the eastern shore. But you can't really lock away something like that. You can only hope it stays sleeping. Walsh had searched extensively for this marker stone, but found nothing that matched Patterson's description. His notes indicate growing frustration with what he termed folklore wild goose chases, though he continued pursuing such leads until his forced retirement in The families never recovered from the loss. Robert and Margaret Whitmore divorced within 2 years, each unable to bear the other's grief. Frank and Helen Carr moved to Ohio, leaving behind the house where they had raised their twin boys. Tom and Patricia Walsh separated after Patricia suffered a complete nervous breakdown that required extended hospitalization. For 44 years, the disappearance of the 5 cousins remained Clearwater County's most infamous unsolved case. The file was reopened periodically when new evidence emerged, or when fresh investigators brought new perspectives to the cold case. But each review reached the same conclusion. 5 children had vanished without a trace from one of the most searched locations in Pennsylvania history. The truth lay waiting in the depths of an ancient well that no one had thought to investigate. It wasn't until the spring of 2024 that a severe drought lowered Cedar Lake's water level enough to expose previously submerged portions of the shoreline. Environmental researchers studying the lake's ecosystem during the drought made a discovery that would reopen the case and provide answers that no one had been prepared to accept. Hidden among the newly exposed cattail roots was a circular stone structure, its iron grate hanging open like a mouth frozen in an eternal scream. Carved symbols covered the surrounding platform, their meaning lost to time but their malevolent intent unmistakable. And inside the structure, at a depth that should have made recovery impossible, was a waterproof camera bag containing a Polaroid camera and dozens of photographs. The photographs told a story that defied rational explanation, documenting not just the final moments of 5 missing children, but glimpses of something far older and more terrible than anyone had imagined. The images showed figures that couldn't exist, places that weren't on any map, and events that challenged the very foundations of what investigators thought they knew about the case. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the final photograph in the sequence, an image that showed the well exactly as it appeared in 2024, with modern drought conditions and contemporary research equipment visible in the background. A photograph taken 44 years before the drought that exposed the well 44 years before the researchers arrived. In the lower right corner of the image, barely visible unless one knew to look for it, was a date stamp, July 12. The implications were staggering, and the investigation that followed would uncover truths that some wished had remained buried forever. Dr. Sarah Chen, the environmental researcher who first spotted the exposed stone structure during the 2024 drought, would later say that she knew immediately something was wrong, not just unusual or historically interesting, but fundamentally cosmically wrong in a way that made her question the basic laws of physics and reality itself. The discovery happened on March 15, 2024, during what was supposed to be a routine survey of drought-exposed areas around Cedar Lake. Chen, a limnologist from Penn State University, had been documenting changes to the lake's ecosystem when her ground-penetrating radar detected an anomalous structure beneath what should have been natural sediment. When the team carefully excavated the area, they found the well exactly as the five cousins had left it, 44 years earlier, except for one impossible detail. The iron grate, which should have been locked, hung open on its ancient hinges. The padlock lay on the stone platform, its metal bright and untarnished despite decades of submersion. But it was the contents of the well that truly defied explanation. At a depth of approximately 30 feet, far below the water table and in an area that should have been flooded for decades, the research team discovered a perfectly preserved leather camera bag. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be modern waterproof material that hadn't existed in 1980, was Timothy Whitmore's Polaroid camera and a collection of photographs that would force investigators to confront the impossible. Detective Marcus Sullivan, now in charge of the cold case unit, was called to the scene within hours of the discovery. Sullivan had been haunted by the Whitmore case since joining the department in 2010, and he approached the well with the grim satisfaction of a man who believed he was finally about to find the answers he'd been seeking. He was not prepared for what the photographs revealed. The first images in the sequence were exactly what investigators might have expected: pictures of the family picnic, shots of Cedar Lake, and photographs of the well structure itself. These matched perfectly with witness statements and evidence collected in. But as Sullivan examined the photographs in chronological order, the impossible began to intrude upon the rational. Photograph number 12 showed the five cousins standing around the well in broad daylight, but their shadows fell at angles that suggested multiple light sources, or perhaps multiple times of day, captured in a single image. Photograph 13 depicted the children again, but now they appeared translucent, as though the camera had captured both their physical forms and something else occupying the same space. By photograph 20, the images had become completely surreal. The children appeared in locations that didn't exist near Cedar Lake. Vast underground chambers, lit by an impossible aurora borealis, stone staircases that spiral down through layers of earth and time, corridors lined with symbols that hurt to look at directly. But it was photograph 28 that stopped Sullivan's investigation cold and sent him reaching for the phone to call the FBI. The image showed the well as it appeared in 2024, during the drought that had exposed it. Dr. Chen was visible in the background, along with her research equipment and the modern excavation tools they had used to uncover the structure. Every detail was perfect, down to the Penn State University logo on Chen's field jacket and the digital timestamp on her electronic equipment. The photograph had been taken 44 years before Dr. Chen was born. The FBI's involvement brought resources and expertise that the local investigation had lacked, but it also brought questions that no one was prepared to answer. Special Agent Diana Rodriguez, a specialist in unusual cases that defied conventional explanation, arrived from Quantico with a team of analysts, forensic experts, and equipment that the locals had never seen before. Rodriguez had worked cases that touched the edges of the explainable: disappearances connected to classified government projects, incidents involving experimental technology, situations where national security concerns intersected with seemingly supernatural events. But the Whitmore case was something entirely different. The photographs were subjected to every test available to modern forensic science. Carbon dating of the paper and chemical analysis of the film confirmed that they had indeed been produced in 1980, using materials and techniques available at that time. Digital analysis revealed no signs of tampering, manipulation, or forgery. The images were, by every scientific measure, authentic. Yet they showed events that could not have happened, places that did not exist, and future circumstances that should have been impossible to predict. The deeper Rodriguez's team delved into the evidence, the more unsettling the discoveries became. Enhanced analysis of the later photographs revealed details that had been invisible to the naked eye: text written in margins, symbols hidden in shadows, and patterns that seemed to shift when viewed through different instruments. One photograph, when subjected to ultraviolet analysis, revealed writing in what appeared to be Timothy's handwriting. "We understand now The well isn't just a passage, it's a lens. We can see all times from here, all possibilities. The lady in white was trying to warn us, but we couldn't understand. By the time we realized what we were looking at, it was too late to go back. Another image, when viewed through polarized filters, showed a message that made Rodriguez's hands shake as she read it. Tell Detective Walsh he was right about the marker stone. The early settlers didn't build it to keep something in, they built it to keep something out. We broke the seal when we opened the well. God forgive us, we broke the seal. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came when the team attempted to photograph the well themselves. Every camera that was aimed at the structure malfunctioned in exactly the same way. Digital cameras produced images that showed the well as it had appeared in 1980, with the iron grate locked and the area overgrown with vegetation that had been cleared away during the excavation. Film cameras captured multiple exposures on single frames, showing the well in different states simultaneously. Video equipment recorded footage that played backward, showing their investigation in reverse chronological order. It was Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a physicist brought in to consult on the electromagnetic anomalies detected around the well, who first proposed the theory that would eventually be accepted by the classified report filed with the Department of Defense. Hartwell's analysis of the site revealed energy signatures unlike anything in the scientific literature, patterns that suggested the local space-time continuum had been fundamentally damaged or altered. Her preliminary report, later classified at the highest levels of government secrecy, concluded that the well represented a breach in the normal flow of causality itself. What we are dealing with, she wrote in a memo that would never see public release, is not a crime scene in any conventional sense. This location represents a point where the linear progression of time has been compromised. Past, present, and future exist simultaneously here, allowing for events to occur outside their proper chronological sequence. The implications were staggering. If Hartwell's theory was correct, then the 5 cousins had not simply vanished. They had been displaced across time itself, existing in a state that allowed them to witness and document events from their own future, while remaining trapped in a temporal loop that began with their first encounter with the well. But theory was one thing. Proof was another. The proof came when Rodriguez's team made the decision to descend into the well itself. Using specialized equipment and safety protocols developed for cave exploration, a team of 3 investigators descended into the depths that had claimed the Whitmore children. What they found challenged every assumption they had made about the case and the nature of reality itself. The well did not extend straight down as expected. After approximately 20 feet, it opened into a vast underground chamber that should not have been able to exist in the local geology. The walls were covered with the same symbols found on the stone platform above, but here they glowed with a phosphorescent light that required no external energy source. In the center of the chamber stood 5 figures. The cousins appeared exactly as they had on the day of their disappearance. Rebecca still 16, Timothy 14, Jennifer 13, and the twins forever 8 years old. But they were not ghosts or hallucinations. They were physically present, solid and real, though they seemed to exist in a state that defied normal biological processes. They did not age. They did not breathe. They did not speak in voices that could be recorded by conventional equipment. But they communicated nonetheless, conveying information through means that the investigators would later struggle to describe in their reports. The children explained, though explained was an inadequate word for the process, that their initial encounter with the well had torn a hole in the fabric of time itself. They had fallen not just into the depths below, but into a space that existed outside normal temporal flow. From this vantage point, they could observe all moments simultaneously, past, present, and future spreading out before them like a vast landscape viewed from a great height. They had watched their own families search for them in 1980. They had witnessed Detective Walsh's investigation and his growing obsession with the case. They had seen Dr. Chen's discovery decades before it happened, and Rodriguez's team descending into the well to find them. Most disturbing of all, they had seen what was coming next. The photographs Timothy had taken were not just documentation of their experience. They were warnings. Each image had been carefully composed to convey information about future events, clues that might allow the authorities to prevent catastrophe. Because the breach in time was growing larger, the children's displacement had created a crack in reality that widened with each passing year. Other locations around the world were beginning to show similar anomalies, places where cause and effect broke down, where past and future bled through into the present. The well at Cedar Lake was not an isolated incident, but the first visible sign of a much larger problem. The entity that Dr. Chen's research team had unknowingly disturbed was not malevolent in any human sense. It was simply incompatible with linear existence. Its very presence in the normal flow of time created paradoxes and contradictions that threatened to unravel the chronological structure of reality itself. The children had been trying to contain the damage, using their unique position outside normal time to observe and warn. But they were running out of temporal stability. The space they occupied was collapsing, and when it finally collapsed completely, the breach would expand exponentially. The investigation team had perhaps weeks before the phenomenon reached a critical threshold. Rodriguez's final report, classified immediately upon completion and buried in archives that few people knew existed, recommended immediate action on multiple fronts. The well needed to be sealed using methods that the children had revealed through their impossible photographs techniques, involving specific geometric patterns, electromagnetic frequencies, and materials that would not be invented for another decade. But even as Rodriguez filed her report, she knew it was too late for conventional solutions. The children had shown them one final photograph, taken with equipment that would not exist until it showed Cedar Lake as a perfectly circular crater, the surrounding landscape twisted into impossible geometries, and figures walking through the ruins, who cast shadows in directions that defied the laws of physics. At the bottom of the photograph, written in Timothy's careful handwriting, was a single word: soon. The official government response was swift and unprecedented. Cedar Lake was declared a federal research site and closed to all civilian access. The families of the missing children were contacted by government representatives and asked to sign non-disclosure agreements in exchange for financial compensation and answers. They were told they wouldn't want to fully understand. Dr. Chen and her research team were relocated to undisclosed positions within classified government programs. Detective Sullivan was offered early retirement with full benefits and a pension that required him to never speak publicly about the case. Special Agent Rodriguez disappeared entirely, her personnel file sealed and her current status unknown to anyone without the highest security clearances. The well itself was filled with a concrete mixture, containing specific additives that had been described in the children's photographs. The entire area was covered with a geodetic dome that deflected both electromagnetic radiation and visual observation. To any civilian who might approach the area, the dome would appear to be empty space, a psychological effect achieved through classified technology developed from the children's warnings about future events. But the children themselves remained. According to the classified reports filed quarterly with a department that officially doesn't exist, the 5 cousins continue to exist in their temporal bubble beneath the sealed well. They age slowly, perhaps one day for every year that passes in normal time, and they continue to observe the flow of events across decades and centuries. They have become humanity's early warning system, monitoring the timeline for anomalies and paradoxes that might threaten the stability of linear existence. Their photographs, now taken with equipment provided by the government, document threats that may not manifest for decades or centuries. The latest reports suggest that they have identified 17 other locations around the world where similar breaches are developing. Teams of specialists trained in temporal mechanics, a science that officially doesn't exist, work around the clock to prevent the kind of cascade failure that nearly occurred at Cedar Lake. Margaret Whitmore, now in her 80s and living in a government-subsidized facility, receives monthly updates on her daughter's condition. The reports are heavily redacted, but they confirm that Rebecca is alive, well, and performing services vital to national security. She is not allowed to visit, and she is not allowed to discuss these reports with anyone, but she knows her daughter is making a difference. Sometimes, late at night, Margaret dreams of a 16-year-old girl, standing in a place where time moves differently, watching over a world that will never know her sacrifice. In these dreams, Rebecca waves to her from across an impossible distance, and Margaret waves back, knowing that somewhere outside normal time, her daughter can see her. The official records state that the Whitmore case was solved through conventional investigation, and that the 5 missing children were found deceased due to an accidental drowning in a previously unknown underwater cave system. The bodies were cremated according to family wishes, and the case was closed. But in a vault beneath a mountain in Colorado, 44 years' worth of impossible photographs tell a different story. They document a love so strong that it transcended time itself, a sacrifice so profound that it continues to protect humanity from threats that most people cannot imagine. The children are still out there, still watching, still warning. And sometimes, late at night, when the electromagnetic conditions are just right, Timothy's photographs show visitors approaching Cedar Lake, visitors whose faces are familiar, but who won't be born for another 20 years. The timeline continues to fray at the edges, and the children continue their vigil, guardians of a secret that must never be fully revealed but must never be forgotten. In her final diary entry, written 44 years ago, but discovered last week in a vault that shouldn't exist, Rebecca Whitmore left a message for the future. We chose this. When we understood what was at stake, we chose to stay. Tell our families we love them, tell them we are still here, watching over everyone, and tell them that some sacrifices echo across eternity, creating ripples that protect those who come after. The government file on the Whitmore case is scheduled to be declassified in the year 2025, assuming temporal stability is maintained until then. Until that time, the official story stands: 5 children vanished during a picnic and were never found. But the truth, as it always does, exists somewhere between the official records and the impossible photographs that continue to arrive, postmarked from nowhere, documenting a future that 5 brave children are working to protect. Cedar Lake remains closed to the public, and it will remain closed for the foreseeable future. The dome that covers the well site continues to deflect casual observation, and the children continue their eternal watch from a place where time moves differently. The well that claimed 5 lives in 1980 now protects countless others from threats they will never know existed. And in the depths below, where past and future meet in an endless present, 5 cousins keep their vigil, guardians of a timeline that must not be allowed to break. Some mysteries are never meant to be solved completely. Some truths are too dangerous for general knowledge. And some sacrifices are so profound that they echo across eternity, protecting those who come after from dangers they cannot imagine. The children are still missing. The children are still there. And somewhere outside normal time, they are still taking photographs of a future that depends on their eternal vigilance. The case file remains open, in a sense. It will always remain open, because the story it documents is still unfolding, one impossible photograph at a time.